Zach here from Gravel Bike, California in Shelter Cove. I'm ready to take you into part 2 of the Lost Coast. I was happy with day 1, but I knew that the second day was about managing resources. Starting off with the toughest climb of probably the whole trip, and then heading into a remote area was really about limiting damage. For the third day, we covered just 140 miles. Yeah, the adventure just gets bigger. Let's roll. Thanks to the unknown from the dirt, I knew day 2 would be the toughest physically and mentally, despite this tranquil setting. You don't want a 2.5 mile climb at over 11% to kick things off, but not much of a choice coming out of Shelter Cove. Charisse Mountain offered less undulations and also the possibility of water. At 25 miles, Usal Road offered the longest continuous stretch of dirt for this trip. After reaching the campground, the last 5 miles was among the prettiest. Even though merging onto Highway 1, it would still be another 7.5 miles behind the Lost Coast. Finally reaching the Pacific Ocean, it was another 6 miles until lunch in Westport. The last 16 miles was easy on paper if all was still going well. Overall, I clocked in 66 miles, pounded by an ever so heavy 9,000 feet of vert. It was a quiet start, as Shelter Cove didn't seem awake yet, waiting for the right time to assess. Although today's the shortest, I'm kind of worried most about getting through it. First of all, it's about over 7,000 feet of climbing in the first 35 miles. Also, there's no water until 10 miles after that. Please get me through this. After experiencing the mugginess yesterday on dirt, on top of carrying my standard 3 bottles, I left behind a lock and a couple of shirts to jam in even more water with a solid climb in the first mile, feeling like a helicopter with all this elevation gain quickly, but I hadn't met the worst of it merging onto Shelter Cove Road. As you can read the excitement on my face on this short downhill, with no way to cushion my concern of this 1,500 feet of climbing, not to mention the looming fog waiting above. And while there are some side streets that may cut down the grade, I stuck with the evil I knew, no matter how slow, as even Yuri Oswald and Miguel Crawford hitchhiked here on their fame trip, instead opting to be a pylon for those passing, with the general store marking the halfway point of the climb that I planned to skip as it was just opening, formally and painfully saying goodbye to Shelter Cove, as it was getting slippery and sloggy to pull out the camera the rest of the way, biting my lip long enough with these clouds offering little solace, finally reaching the peak for an hour's worth of work where I exited the dirt yesterday, amazed on this quarter-mile descent how quickly things got saturated, to the point it was hard to see the turnoff to Charisse Mountain that was calmer in every way as I was both recovering and waking up from that climb, with only a brief moment outside of the haze, before becoming a full resident of the Dagobah system for the next few hours, as there was a surprising amount of company around, also coming up on a few campgrounds that were in various states of availability, trying to address my water situation, already down 2 bottles. Signs in town said there may be water at the campgrounds. Instantly gets a go. This half-mile 7% climb shouldn't have felt that taxing, but I tried tempering my effort even more, feeling like yesterday was already coming into play, as the top greeted me with dirt and my camera work returned in kind with wetness. But I knew I was now in Mendocino County with this game of upmanship paving the road as the occasional home started to pop up, as in this jurisdiction I was now on Usal Road with the do not look here fences like in Humboldt, but I did my research that a school was coming up, though unsure whether water would be available during the summer, as Whale Gulch is so remote. This K-12 school provides their own water and electricity, and while I thought I packed enough, a refill couldn't have hurt, missing that there were also fountains by the street when school's in session, meaning I had now only 30 miles until my next water, soon seeing the transition to dirt, with my most fearful chapter of this journey ahead. I start off optimistic, even though I threw a light on in case of oncoming traffic, with my initial thoughts, enjoying the celestial feel as the clouds dramatically revealed the foreground, and I appreciated the mile markings on this county road that defines the Sinkyone Wilderness to the west and the Usal Redwood Forest to the east, where your only opportunity to ride that area is during Grasshopper's Usal event. And while I enjoyed the cathedral aesthetic, I wondered for how long. Feeling lucky, the road was open as I forgot to check in my prep. But even though I wasn't pedaling hard, the miles were not peeling off as fast as I expected, with the reason right in front of me, as the surface wasn't flypaper quality, but sticky nonetheless. Starting to feel more isolated, seeing only signs of anti-life, constantly doing math with the mile markers, calculating how long it would take if I needed to walk back, as circumstances weren't getting any more encouraging, and while hearkening Game of Thrones wasn't helping me any, I did want to be noticed by the only people I'd happen across.
Hello. Hi there.
While Usal's profile isn't extreme, it felt like death by 1,000 paper cuts, combining the weight of everything I was carrying with the light mud and constant undulations. I knew I'd feel far more relieved coming up on the campground, now 10 miles away.
I can't believe I'm only just a little past halfway of climbing of the day. I'm only 22 miles in.
6 more miles of seesawing would get me to the long downhill. And some of these large pockets of sun didn't make much sense, as the occasional ray would pierce its way through, but it didn't make much of a difference on the surface on this 3-mile descent, with my tires tracking all types of mud and a problem I wouldn't discover until later, focusing primarily on not sliding out, now actually seeing some sky for the first time since leaving Shelter Cove, with the lushness and open gate meaning I was nearing the creek, fine with an unceremonious entrance into the campground. Just happy to have the most basic of amenities. And while the beach wasn't too far from the turnoff, I chose just to forge ahead to save every piece of energy, with the worst climb on Usal Road just ahead, with the first mile averaging 14%, compounded by a variety of mud layers. But in the midst of this effort, there was clearly a spot to appreciate it all.
Super tempting to go back down. I just know it looks so peaceful and calming. Probably spent a few hours there. This will be enough up here.
While it was hard for me to comprehend Usal, this view pieced together how I drifted through the low altitude layers of fog, and all the beauty I was so close to, as seeing the coastline brought some sense of accomplishment. But I still had 1,000 feet of climbing over the next 3 miles of dirt, and heading back into the clouds wasn't mentally uplifting, especially getting this view with the coast right below me, taking the outside of the curves to cut down as much of the grade as possible, and to help me avoid the few vehicles coming by that I didn't get on camera, and forgetting how my seat pack served a dual purpose as a mudguard, feeling like Groundhog Day every time I thought I was close to being done.
I think that's it for the dirt climbing. I need a prize. Just need to get out of here.
The last 2 miles on Usal was all about descending, and glad to get a parting gift near the end, with my last view of the ocean from the Lost Coast, reflecting on the scale what I've accomplished so far on my own, with a sense of fulfillment ending on such a high note, finally finishing off dirt, discreetly reaching Highway 1, ready to chew on the consistency of pavement for the duration. Technically, I was still locked in by the Lost Coast. Glad to have the first 3 miles tick off with a slight decline, and someone kind enough to highlight today's last 2 stops on this sign. But there was one final test with this 1.75 mile climb at 7% that normally wouldn't be that big of a thing, except now I was feeling the cumulative effects of this journey. Not encouraging, as I hadn't even passed the halfway point for this entire trip, though feeling a sensation I hadn't experienced since I'd been on the North Coast, able to enjoy a downhill without any inhibitions, followed by the exhilaration crossing Hardy Creek, defining the southern tip, approaching the end of the Lost Coast. Taking a moment to commemorate closing this formidable chapter, able to exhale for the first time, even though there were more challenges ahead. The Mendocino Coast has always been one of my favorite places to drive, but I knew this would be an even better experience by bike, as Highway 1 doesn't feel too heavily trafficked here, but just enough people around not to feel extremely remote. Coming up on Westport with all these campers set up, including those permanently in place over this gorgeous outlook, with the iconic blue whale welcoming me into this town of under 100, stopping for lunch in the community store, where a couple of cyclists stopped by too, including Mike, showing his watercolors from his trip that started in Alaska, as I was ready for this last leg of today's ride, able to enjoy this majestic scenery at a pedestrian pace, with my body not giving me much of a choice. Once again, getting unjustly rewarded for not checking highway conditions ahead of time, and glad the clouds weren't right up on everything, thinking I was making great progress. But I was suspicious how Mike blew past me with all that extra gear, and turning off the highway to take the path through McCurshire State Park, I finally realized why my ride felt so sloggy, with my front tire warped and wobbly. Not a good sign for day 3. Though nothing I could do now but enjoy the scenery until I reached town, as I fulfilling my goal of finally riding over the Pudding Creek Trestle Bridge, leading me into the largest town between Eureka and San Francisco along the coast in Fort Bragg, but I didn't have enough time for sightseeing as this tire issue needed to be addressed, stopping into Fort Bragg Cycle Reef just along the highway. So Mark spent a good amount of time trying to fix it, but was also unsure if a new tire would solve the problem. So I reluctantly pulled out my larger spare, thinking it would make it more wobbly, but miracle of miracles, I had accidentally packed my smaller tire. So there was cause for celebration, heading to one of my favorite breweries in California to eat and drink, going into my final day.
Well, I don't know if I could properly assess today, other than it's a success for finishing. It was definitely a lot tougher than I thought. Even though it was hours and miles less, it did pound at me. Still, I feel confident they can get through tomorrow, but that's normally the killer.